While the world debates military strategies and economic sanctions, there exists a text over 2,500 years old that describes with unsettling detail a confrontation between ancient Persia and the nation of Israel. The prophet Ezekiel recorded alliances, troop movements, and an outcome that no geopolitical analyst would dare predict. The question is not whether the Bible mentions this conflict. The question is why so many ignore what it has already revealed. Think of the current scenario. Iran possesses a territory of 1,648,000 square kilometers. Its population exceeds 88 million inhabitants. The country maintains an arsenal estimated at more than 3,000 ballistic missiles, some with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers, capable of hitting any point in Israeli territory in less than 12 minutes. On the other side, Israel occupies a strip of land smaller than the state of Sergipe, with about 22,000 square kilometers and approximately 9,800,000 inhabitants. In purely mathematical terms, the territorial proportion is 75:1. The population proportion is 9:1. By any human calculation, this equation should have a predictable result. But the Bible tells a different story, and this story begins long before Iran was called Iran. The ancient name of the region is Persia, and it appears dozens of times in the scriptures. But it is in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 that the scenario takes on the contours of a strategic nightmare. The prophet describes a coalition led by a figure named Gog, of the land of Magog, who gathers nations such as Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya to march against Israel. The text is precise in describing that this attack will happen when Israel is living in apparent security, inhabiting cities without walls, without bars, without gates. Consider this for a moment. Ezekiel wrote these words around 590 years before Christ. At that time, Israel was destroyed, the temple in ruins, the people deported to Babylon. To speak of Israel inhabiting its land in security was not only improbable, it was absurd. How could an exiled prophet surrounded by rubble describe a scenario that would only begin to materialize 2,500 years later, in 1948, with the founding of the modern state of Israel? This is the first layer of what the Bible reveals. But there is something even more disturbing when you look at the military details. Ezekiel 38 verses 4 and 5 list the components of the invading coalition. Persia is in first place, not as a secondary ally, not as an observer, as a direct participant equipped with shields and helmets. In the original Hebrew, the word used for the weaponry suggests a completely prepared military force, not an improvised militia. Alongside Persia appear Cush, frequently associated with Ethiopia and regions of Sudan, and Phut, linked to Libya. Now observe the current geopolitical configuration. Iran finances and arms Hezbollah in Lebanon, maintains a military presence in Syria, supports militias in Yemen and Iraq, and sustains strategic relations with nations of North Africa. Sudan, until recently, received Iranian weaponry through the corridor that crosses the Red Sea. The coincidence between the prophetic map and the contemporary map is not subtle, it is disconcerting. But the Bible does not stop at the description of the threat. It describes what happens when this coalition advances. Ezekiel 38 verses 18 to 22 records the divine response with a language that makes any military scenario seem insignificant. The text speaks of a devastating earthquake, torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and brimstone. The earth shakes in such a way that the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, and every human being upon the face of the earth shall tremble before the presence of the Lord. Dimension this. The prophet does not describe an Israeli military counteroffensive. He does not mention the Iron Dome system, which today intercepts rockets with a success rate of around 90%. He does not speak of F-35 aircraft or nuclear-capable submarines. The defense described is exclusively supernatural. And the result is so devastating that Ezekiel 39 verses 12 to 15 states that Israel will take 7 months just to bury the dead of the invading army. 7 months. To bury corpses. The operation will be so massive that professional teams will be hired exclusively for this task, scouring the land in search of remains that have not yet been located. When a civilian finds a bone, they must signal the location with a marker so that the specialized team may perform the proper burial. Have you ever stopped to think about what this means in terms of scale? If a modern army of 100,000 soldiers were annihilated in the open field, considering the time necessary for identification, transport and burial in minimum sanitary conditions, the operation would take weeks, perhaps 2 months. 7 months suggests an invading force of proportions that defy any reasonable estimate. Some scholars point to a contingent that could exceed 500,000 troops, also considering equipment, vehicles and logistical infrastructure that would need to be decontaminated and removed. And here arises a question that few ask. Why does God intervene in this way? Why not simply strengthen the Israeli army and allow victory to come through conventional means? Ezekiel 38 verse 23 answers with a clarity that eliminates any ambiguity. The text says that the purpose is so that the nations may know that He is the Lord. The intervention is designed to be inexplicable by any human analysis. It cannot be attributed to Israeli technology, to Mossad intelligence, to American support, or to any earthly alliance. It needs to be so absurdly disproportionate that the only possible conclusion is the recognition of a hand that transcends geopolitics. This divine logic is not new in the scriptures. It appears as a recurring pattern that, when you begin to identify it, completely changes the way you view biblical events. If you are following this reflection and feeling that there is something in the scriptures that goes far beyond what most perceive, know that this feeling is not accidental. Most people know biblical events by the surface, by the stories they heard in childhood, by verses repeated without context. But there is a depth that completely transforms the understanding of faith, especially when it comes to the most decisive moment in history, the final hours of Jesus on the cross. Each word that Christ pronounced on that wood carried a weight that shook all of Jerusalem. And this meaning is gathered in the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem. If you want to access it now, it is very simple. Take your phone, open the camera app and point it at the square code appearing on the screen at this moment. A secure link will appear automatically, just tap it, and you will have immediate access to the material. If you prefer, the link is also in the description of this video. On your phone, tap the video title or the More option to open the description. On a computer or television, look just below the video. Thousands of people are already deepening their faith through this reading, and by accessing it, you also help keep this channel active so that we can continue bringing biblical content like this. Access now and comment Amen below. Returning to the divine pattern, consider the case of Gideon recorded in Judges chapter 7. 32,000 Israelite soldiers presented themselves to face the Midianite army, which the text describes as being as numerous as locusts, with camels as countless as the sand of the seashore. God looked at the 32,000 and said they were too many. Too many. Before an army that covered the entire valley, God reduced the Israelite force to 300 men. 300 against what is estimated at more than 135,000 combatants. The proportion was 450 to 1, and the chosen weapon was not swords or spears. They were torches inside clay jars and trumpets. The result was that the Midianites entered into total panic, turned their swords against one another, and fled. The victory was so absurd that no general could claim it. That was exactly the point. The same pattern appears in Exodus. 600 Egyptian chariots of war, the most advanced military force of the ancient world, each chariot equivalent to an armored tank of the time, pursued about 600,000 Israelite families cornered between mountains and the Red Sea. There was no escape route. There was no plan B. The people were literally trapped between certain death and the water. Moses raised his staff, the sea opened, and the same chariots that represented the military supremacy of Egypt were swallowed by the water that returned to its place. The most powerful army on the planet was eliminated without a single Israelite sword being unsheathed. Pharaoh lost not only his army, but the entire symbol of his power. Observe how this pattern applies to the prophecy of Ezekiel. Iran represents today a regional military power with proven capacity to produce hypersonic missiles, swarm attack drones, and possibly nuclear weapons in an advanced stage of development. Reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency indicate that Iran has accumulated uranium enriched to 60% in sufficient quantity that, if enriched to 90%, it could produce at least 3 nuclear warheads. Israel, with all its defense apparatus, including the Arrow 3 system, capable of intercepting missiles outside the Earth's atmosphere, and David's sling designed for medium-range missiles, recognizes that no defense is 100% efficient against a saturated attack when hundreds of missiles are launched simultaneously to overwhelm interception systems. But it is precisely at this point of vulnerability that biblical prophecy inserts something that no military simulation software can calculate: the direct intervention of the Creator. There is another detail in Ezekiel 39 that frequently goes unnoticed and adds a surprising layer to the scenario. Verses 9 and 10 state that, after the destruction of the invading army, the inhabitants of Israel will use the weapons of the enemies as fuel for 7 years, 7 whole years burning weaponry. To contextualize, during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel captured Syrian and Egyptian military equipment in a quantity that took months to be catalogued. But 7 years of fuel from captured weapons suggests a volume of military equipment so massive that it defies any historical precedent. Some scholars interpret that the description may include high-technology composite materials that possess energy value when processed, something unthinkable in the 6th century before Christ, but perfectly plausible with the technology of polymers and composites used in modern weaponry. This biblical narrative also answers an objection that frequently arises. If God protects Israel, why did the Holocaust happen? Why did 6 million Jews perish in Nazi camps? The answer requires intellectual honesty. The Scriptures never promise the absence of suffering for the Jewish people. What they promise is preservation as a nation. Deuteronomy chapter 28 describes with distressing detail the consequences of disobedience, including dispersion among the nations, persecution, and terror. But the same God who allowed the 70-year Babylonian exile, the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 AD, and the diaspora of nearly 2 millennia, this same God declared in Jeremiah 31, verses 35 to 37, that Israel would only cease to be a nation before him if the laws that govern the sun, the moon, and the stars cease to function. As long as the moon shines in the sky, Israel remains. That is the promise. And when we look at modern history, this promise acquires a disconcerting weight. In 1948, less than 3 years after the Holocaust, the State of Israel was proclaimed. No nation in the history of humanity was dispersed for nearly 2,000 years, lost its territory, its sovereignty, suffered persecutions on practically every continent, and then returned to the same land with the same language, the same identity. Hebrew, which was a dead language used only in liturgical contexts, was resurrected by a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda at the end of the 19th century, and today is spoken by more than 9 million people as a native language. There is no historical parallel for this, none. If this pattern of faith and divine intervention awakens in you the need to understand more deeply what the Scriptures reveal, especially about the moment when all biblical history converged to a single point, the final hours of Christ on the cross, then the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, was prepared exactly for this deepening. Point your phone's camera at the QR code on the screen or access through the link in the description and begin this reading now. Accessing the material also helps keep this channel producing biblical content. Comment, Amen. Now, when we bring the prophecy of Ezekiel into the context of recent years, the pieces begin to fit in a way that causes shivers. In April of 2024, Iran launched against Israel the largest attack with ballistic missiles and drones ever recorded against a sovereign nation in modern history. There were more than 300 projectiles, including 170 Shahed 136 drones, more than 30 cruise missiles, and about 120 ballistic missiles. The attack was launched from Iranian territory, more than 1,600 kilometers away. The operation involved coordination with militias in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. The result expected by Iran was mass devastation. The actual result was that 99% of the projectiles were intercepted. 99%. Material damage was minimal. A Bedouin child suffered minor injuries, no deaths. To dimension what this means in military terms, imagine someone throwing 300 stones at you from different directions at the same time, and you manage to dodge or block 297 of them. Military analysts from all over the world were astonished. The Wall Street Journal called the defense operation unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. Retired Pentagon generals declared that no defense system in the world should be capable of achieving that success rate against a saturated attack of that magnitude. Technological coincidence, or the hand described in Ezekiel 38 already operating behind the scenes? Because there is a detail that the media mentioned little. On the night of the attack, atmospheric conditions over Jordan and Israel changed abruptly. High-altitude winds reduced the effective speed of the drones, giving defense systems additional time to track and eliminate targets. Jordanian pilots also intercepted drones crossing their airspace, something that was not previously coordinated in public regional defense protocols. A series of apparently disconnected factors converged at the same instant to produce a statistically improbable result. The prophet Ezekiel would not have used the word coincidence. And it is at this point that the issue becomes deeply personal, because the prophecy is not just about Israel. Ezekiel 39 verse 7 declares that God will make his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel and will not allow it to be profaned. The ultimate goal is not geopolitical, it is revelational. God uses the Israel-Iran scenario as a stage where his sovereignty becomes visible to all nations. This includes you now, reading these words. But the prophecy also contains a dimension that is unsettling. It suggests that things will get worse before they get better. Ezekiel 38 verse 16 says that the coalition will go up against Israel like a cloud that covers the land. The image is of total darkness, of a moment where all human hope is exhausted, where military calculations, diplomacy, and technology reach their limit. It is at that exact instant of apparently impenetrable darkness that the intervention happens. Not before. Not when there is still room to attribute the result to human competence, but at the precise moment when the only possible explanation is transcendent. This principle echoes throughout the Bible. The Israelites only saw the sea open when the dust of the Egyptian chariots was already visible on the horizon. Daniel was only rescued after spending the entire night with the lions. The 3 Hebrew youths were only preserved after being thrown into the furnace, heated 7 times more than normal. The pattern is consistent. Deliverance does not come to avoid the crisis. It comes within the crisis when no human alternative remains. For the current scenario, this implies that the confrontation between Iran and Israel may reach a point of tension that will seem irreversible. There may be moments where headlines will announce that Israel is cornered, that destruction is inevitable, that no alliance will be sufficient. If Ezekiel is correct, it is exactly in those moments that the invisible hand will reveal itself in the most forceful way. Biblical history has always moved in this direction. Every crisis was a stage, every apparent defeat a prelude to an intervention that redefined the limits of the possible. And the confrontation with modern Persia, Iran, may be the greatest of these stages. And all this reflection on divine sovereignty, in the midst of chaos, on the hand that acts when all seems lost, finds its highest point at the cross. Because if God operates in impossible scenarios to reveal his glory, the most impossible scenario in history was Calvary, where the death of the Son seemed the final defeat and revealed itself as the greatest victory ever recorded. Point your phone's camera at the QR code on the screen and access the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, to understand what each word of Christ on that cross meant. The link is also available in the video description. On your phone, tap the title or more. On the computer, look below the video. Accessing helps keep this channel bringing reflections like this. Comment, Amen. There is still a perspective that connects Ezekiel to the New Testament directly. The Apostle John, in Revelation 20 verses 7 to 9, takes up the figure of Gog and Magog in an eschatological context that many scholars consider a second phase of the same conflict described in Ezekiel. In the text of Revelation, the nations gather in number as the sand of the sea and surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city. Again, the response is not military. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. The language is practically identical to that of Ezekiel. The message is the same. The defense of Israel has never depended on human alliances, although God uses them as instruments. The defense depends on a promise that precedes every geopolitical configuration, every treaty, and every technology. When Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, holding an illustration of what he described as the Iranian nuclear program, he did not know he was acting in a script that Ezekiel had already written. When Iranian generals publicly declare that Israel will be wiped off the map, they do not realize they are repeating the same arrogance of Pharaoh before the Red Sea, of Goliath before a teenager with a sling, of Nebuchadnezzar before 3 youths who refused to bow. The result in all cases was the same, and here is the point that unites everything. The Bible does not present Israel as a perfect, innocent nation or one free from flaws. The Old Testament is brutally honest about the moral, spiritual, and political failures of the Jewish people. Corrupt kings, widespread idolatry, social injustice, the murder of prophets. The text hides nothing. But the promise of preservation was never conditioned on the moral performance of Israel. It was conditioned on the faithfulness of God to His own word. This changes everything, because it means that the intervention described in Ezekiel is not a reward for good behavior. It is the demonstration that when God makes a covenant, no power, no arsenal, no coalition in the universe can invalidate it. Iran, with its missiles and its alliances, faces something that no radar can detect and no anti-missile system can combat. It faces a word that was spoken before Persia built its first palace in Persepolis, a word that survived empires that today are dust in museums, a word that remains as operative today as on the day it came out of the mouth of the Creator. When you look at the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East today, with ballistic missiles, nuclear programs, and alliances that are redesigned every week, it is easy to believe that the fate of Israel depends exclusively on human decisions. But the Scriptures present a radically different perspective. The same God who opened the Red Sea, who brought down the walls of Jericho with sound, who reduced an army of 32,000 to 300 men in the hands of Gideon, this same God declared that the history of Israel does not end by the decree of any earthly power. This does not mean passivity. It means that behind every diplomatic treaty, every missile interception, every decision made in war rooms that the public will never see, there is a hand that has already written the final chapter. And this chapter, recorded by prophets who had no political reason to invent what they wrote, points to an outcome that defies all military logic. The true question was never whether Israel would survive. The true question was always whether you would recognize the hand behind the survival. This hand, the same that sustained Israel against Egypt, against Babylon, against Rome, against the Holocaust, is the same hand that was nailed to a cross 2,000 years ago so that you, personally, could have access to the same God who moves nations and disarms armies. The digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, reveals what each of those final words meant for Jerusalem, for history, and for your life. Take your phone now, open the camera, and point it at the QR code on the screen. The link will appear automatically. Just tap to begin reading. If you are on your phone, the link is also in the description. Tap the video title or more to find it. On the computer or television, just look below the video. By accessing, you strengthen this channel and help us continue producing deep biblical reflections like this. Access now. And comment Amen.